Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom.
And me, Rob.
Welcome to listeners and again new listeners, because we keep seeing brand new listeners. It's great to see all these new listeners too.
So much interest in gases and energy and all these hot topics. Eh?
It really is. And today we're going to return to a theme which we've covered a number of times in the last few weeks now, but we really do have to, and quite a timely topic for us as well. And that's the CO2 market, the fragilities in that market and the improvements to C2.
Yeah, so a couple of episodes we informed everyone, didn't we, that there is a lot of attention at the moment in the UK where CO2 supplies are concerned, and the impact on food and beverage markets is the prime example. And we tried to explain that at the moment there is no supply crisis, there is no shortage in the UK or Europe, and it was simply a case of government worst case planning, and we very much applaud that. We think that's a refreshing thing to see. Nonetheless, CO2 supplies have very much been in the headlines, haven't they?
They certainly have. So this is probably a good time to look at how things are looking across the UK and Europe. And we've just got back, it's probably a month now since we've got back from our European CO2 Summit in Rotterdam. So we'll look back on some of the takeaways, some of the market indicators from that across this episode too. It's always great to listen back to those sentiments, isn't it?
It is a great reminder, and I think as well, when you do see these stories emerging and so much scrutiny on these supply chains, it is great to be able to go back and just remind yourself, kind of anchor yourself in, actually, this is where we stand at the moment, this is what's happening, and this is where it's going.
And we started that event with our session on markets and feedstocks, and our very own Aidan Sparrowhawk of GWGI spoke about the CO2 market in 2026. So what were some of the key points from that presentation and some of the indicators that he gave us?
Yeah, so for listeners and those that weren't in the room, Aidan is our Data Intelligence Director. He heads up the whole kind of business intelligence department within gasworld. So Aidan and his team are really monitoring and mapping all of the industrial gas markets globally, including CO2. And that's everything from plant capacities and status and outages through to, the demand side projections and everything in between. So in Rotterdam, Aidan was up on stage presenting the CO2 market in Europe as we see it, as our data sees it today, and where it could be heading in the next, 5-year period. It was interesting because Aidan also reflected on some of that industry sentiment analysis that Gasworld's been carrying in the last few months, and how that correlated with what we're seeing in the data and to an extent on the ground as well.
So perhaps instead of us talking around that, we should take a listen back to some of the things that Aidan had to say.
At Gasworld, we're tracking about 800 CO2 plants globally, producing around about 90,000 tonnes per day. You can see on the right-hand side, Europe accounts for about 24%, around about a quarter of that. Looking back over the last decade, that's grown. It's grown by about 5%. So Europe is taking a leading role in growing the supply, albeit the overall supply is growing across the board. But Europe is definitely sort of growing its share there. A few key points that I'll pick out over upcoming slides. I mentioned 800 facilities across the world. Just shy of a quarter of those are in Europe, sort of dotted around 25 countries. As we'll see, those are sort of quite highly concentrated in sort of half a dozen countries within that 25. We also got a story of concentration when it comes to the sources of CO2, 3/4 coming from two sources. And Rob's alluded to it, but we're beginning to see a sort of consistent fall in confidence in supply within Europe. And actually that data comes from before the beginning of the hostilities in the Middle East. So that will probably be a trend that we will expect to see continuing. Okay, so talked about those 184 plants. You can see on the map on the right-hand side, the blue dots are those plants. You can see quite clearly from that map, there's real concentration there in northwest Europe. The donut chart on the left with the incredibly small labels, so I'll read them out. You've got the top 5 countries accounting for about 2/3 of total supply. So that's Netherlands, Germany, Spain, France, and Belgium. And of course, wherever you have concentration like that, wherever you have high supply in a small number of places, any disruption will mean disruptions will travel across borders, as we would expect to see. The supply itself, how that's changed over the last decade, tells an interesting story. You can see that the black line is Europe, and the sort of the yellow line is the rest of the world. And you can see that they track very closely, also tracking the sort of industrial production. But you can see that the European line is more volatile. You can see it's grown higher than the global average at around about 10% over that decade. But also the peaks are higher and the troughs are lower. I think the story behind the sort of faster than average growth is probably to do with biological processes. We'll see on the next slide where production is breaking down and how it breaks down and the growth areas. But biological certainly is one of them. Recovery in industrial output post 2020 is obviously a key factor here, as is the more stable operating conditions. I think Rob mentioned in his intro. Certainly, we've had a period of stability in Europe since 2022, when energy price rises led to shortages, led to production closing down. Obviously, as I mentioned with the Middle East slide, we can expect to see growing prices and potentially returning to a period of lower stability or indeed supply crunch. The mix, again, story of concentration in terms of where the production is coming from. You can see on the top, 2015, around about just almost 60% came from syngas production. That percentage share has fallen as biological, as chemical, and other sources have grown. All of the areas have grown. Actually, in absolute terms, syngas is still 20% up on where it was last in 10 years ago, but the pattern is changing, which is a sort of slightly different tone from everything else I'm saying, which is about a story of concentration. But this is a bit of a story of diversification. Of course, as is clear from this, and as we all know, CO2 production is a byproduct. It sits downstream of other industrial value chains, as you can see from each of these. Moving from supply into demand, and the thing that I normally end up saying in a presentation like this is that food and beverage remains the largest demand sector, followed by general manufacturing and chemicals. Possibly you can't make it out too clearly here, but when you take away these slides at the end, you'll see this sort of black line on the time series there, right in the middle, which represents food and beverage. And you can see whereas all of the sectors drop in 2020, food and beverages remained relatively consistent, and that sort of really reflects its sort of the large scale and also the sort of embedded processes that are very hard to pause within that sector.
And that was Aidan Sparrowhawk of GWGI. Great to get into those, and some great figures there from the business intelligence team.
Yeah, fantastic. It's always good to get that state of play in the market, certainly as we see it, and then compare and contrast with other speakers and other projections. And as I said just before Aidan spoke there, it's always good to see that kind of, this is what the data says, increasingly this is what the sentiment says, but this is what the boots on the ground appear to be saying and suggesting too.
And talking of boots in the ground, that leads nicely into another speaker that we saw in that first session, and that was Gabriel Kiewek of Nippon Gases, who discussed CO2 in Europe today and tomorrow. Great to get their perspective as a producer and those who are really seeing the business from the inside, what that business looks like today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for context, Nippon Sanso, as it is now, is absolutely at the forefront of CO2 supply in Europe and here in the UK, actually, and has made some great investments in that business as well in the last 5 to 10 years, whether that's storage and distribution terminals or the tankers, the ships, the technologies that move the product around. It's been investing both from a decarbonisation point of view and a security of supply point of view. So almost you can't find a better perspective on the actual market today on the ground.
So let's listen to some of that.
For sure, we're living in interesting times. This is a time, again, for the merchant CO2 market where we are facing significant challenges in our business. There's, again, significant part of the industry, part of the process, where as soon as we have increased cost of power, increased cost of molecules from the main source of the raw gas, immediately we see the effects of this coming. And CO2 for me has been always a tale of the dog wagging the tail and not the other way around, right? Because in every single sense, the CO2 market has been based on companies producing their main molecule, which in many cases, and for the merchant gas market for Europe, we can see it has been either ammonia or ethanol, and where the product, the process, leads into the outcome for us, which has been the CO2, the raw gas molecule that we get as a waste molecule from these industries, and where this molecule has never been part of the equation of should I build this plant or not. So whenever these plants are in a position where it's not feasibly economical to run these plants, the first thing that comes to mind for them is, does it make sense for us to continue to run the plant? And their last thing in their mind is, whoa, what about CO2? So never crosses their mind. And then we end up in a situation where we automatically get into a position of there's no CO2 in the market for the merchant business because there's just no plants running at the capacity that we need to have these plants running. We have seen that ammonia is slightly over 37% of the merchant market here in Europe. And we have seen also ammonia close about 1 million tons of capacity since 2022. We are expecting another 3 million tons of ammonia to shut down in the next few years. And you can say, okay, well, this has been coming, this is expected. We're going to end up in a position where the molecules for ammonia are going to present a decline of the consequential molecules for CO2, and how is this going to impact our business? And the answer is, quite honestly, what we have been hearing here, that these molecules eventually are going to be replaced by the bio CO2 molecules, but in a very different way from what we have seen in the past. Because now the biomolecules and the way that you run the numbers to see and understand if you're going to operate a plant, consider not only the biomethane or the bioproduct that is basically energy intensive to basically power Europe going forward, but the molecule that comes out of that process, which is the CO2 molecule, is now part of the numbers that all of these companies make to make the decisions of how do they want to justify the investment for these plants. In the bioethanol side of the equation, we're expecting to see a significant growth for this type of molecule, mainly in Asia and South America, where the conditions to produce these molecules are much more favorable in terms of power cost and feedstock, much more reliability, much better support from the different governments from that end, and where here in Europe we're going to be in a clear disadvantage to compete for those molecules at the cost of producing against buying those molecules here. When we see the biosource coming from AD, it's a different type of tale. And the story here is much more on what's coming and in the size and in the location of these molecules, because the the math on the perception of how do you want to get those molecules to, at the end of the day, provide the final molecule to your customers are going to be based on very critical calibration of, does it make sense for me to put a liquefaction plant in place to move this molecule to the final customer or not? Today, we can clearly see that most of these plants that are in place at the moment are significant challenges from a capex perspective. So all of the small bio plants that we see in the market have a very high component of capex to bring in those molecules to the market. And in addition to that, you have that the most significant source of savings from a greenhouse gas perspective comes from the most sustainable part of the feedstock, which is the most challenging one for our end users and for our customers.
And that was Gabriel Kiewek of Nippon Sanso there. I also had the chance to speak to Gabriel off stage after his presentation, recorded a short interview around 10 minutes time, so should push listeners towards that video on gasworld.com, and it's on our YouTube page, and I think it's on our social media channels too.
Yeah, it was great that he did that, because he'd also taken some tough questions on stage, which I had to moderate and deliver, and I could sense the feeling of, oh, you're crunching me with these questions. So it's great that he continued to provide that sentiment. Yeah.
And our third speaker in that first session, I feel like we need to listen to all of these because it's such a fantastic session, was Pablo Molina of the European Biogas Association, talking about biogases and biogenic CO2 from biogases and how this could be the key to Europe's carbon strategy going forward, all about those new sources and feedstocks.
Yeah, Pablo's back-to-back performances. Of course, he kind of debuted on the GasWorld stage representing biogas in Rotterdam in 2025. Came back this year, similar talk, but with some more kind of updates of what's actually been happening in the European market. And it was great to see as well. He brings a different perspective to this conversation around CO2, of course, with biogenic CO2 seen as one of those future sourcing channels. And I think as well, it was really interesting. Last year, we ran a poll live on the ground at the event, asking the audience, where do you see the kind of most exciting opportunity for future sourcing in CO2? Biogas and biogenic was resoundingly popular. I can't remember the figure. It was something like 70% of the audience felt that way. It held again. I think it had gone up a couple of percentage points when we reconvened this year for the event. So biogas, biogenic CO2 seen as a big sourcing channel. Certainly is. So let's listen to some of Pablo.
Some insights onto the biogases market. In 2024, we know that 22 BCM of biogases were produced in Europe. When I talk about biogases, I'm referring to the combination of biogas and biomethane. And to put this number into perspective, 22 BCM is equal to the gas consumption of Belgium, Denmark, and Ireland combined. And if we look only at the EU 27, this represents 19 BCM. And again, this is 6% of the EU's natural gas consumption in 2024, showcasing how biomethane is allowing our industry, our sector, not only to break free from this dependency, but also helping the competitiveness of our continent. When it comes to the number of plants, they represent around 21,000 plants in Europe. And here on the graph, we can see on the green, light green, the biogas trajectory over the years. We have seen how it's been, let's say, stagnated in the past year. And the reason for this is that now the focus has been placed on the biomethane sector, which continues to grow. But of course, if we take into consideration the last 2 years, when you look at 2024, the growth slowed down compared to 2023. And the reason for this is some of the instability in the legislation. But we are sure this will rebound as new plans are coming ahead in many different member states. Here, just to give you a quick summary of the numbers. So 25 countries are currently producing biomethane, and this is a 9% increase of production compared to last year. When it comes to the end uses of the biomethane, 25% goes to the transport, 80% in the buildings, 15% power generation, 40% in the industry, and the remaining share is of unbound distillation. 25 million megatons of digestate were produced in 2024, and in 2024 as well, 0.5 megatons of biogenic CO2 were captured. I'll go more into the details of this. And as well, this translates into 250,000 jobs, which are spanned across direct and indirect. Moving on to the CO2 markets future landscape, and also building up with Tudi was mentioning regarding the climate law target of the European Commission. So we have analyzed, the European Commission made an impact assessment to understand exactly how much carbon will be needed to be captured in order to achieve these 90% reductions of emissions by 2040, and this is equal to 344 megatons of CO2. And of course, if we just take, for example, e-fuels in 2040, they will represent 13 times more than today's merchant CO2. So somebody was asking, will it not enter into competition? Well, unfortunately, the European Commission did not even take into consideration the merchant market when they were doing this assessment. They only consider, as you see on the screen, storage materials, fuels, and underground storage. As well, some of the problems on this model is that chemicals were not even included, and for the storage materials, despite this has already been done today, they only consider by 2050 that this will pick up. They also underestimated our contribution to the sector, to the capture of biogenic CO2, only 22 megatons by 2040 and 30 by 2050. So if we look now into different scenarios of what is our potential from the biomethane production, so we've taken here 3 different models. So we have the European Commission, we have the 10-year network development that was done by ENSO-E and ENSO-G, and we have the Guidehouse report of biomethane potentials, which we can translate to CO2. If we focus our attention on 2040, for example, we see that the 10-year network development and the Guidehouse report are more or less in line, with 67 megatons coming from biomethane production, or 89 with the Guidehouse. If we are only considering anaerobic digestion, if we take into account another technology like gasification, the numbers can go even higher. But as I was mentioning before, the biogases is already offering it's already available, it's cost-effective, and it's scalable technology which is already on the market. Nonetheless, we also have to keep ourselves realistic. This is a big potential, but in order to unlock it, there's still some work to be done, specifically on the stable regulatory framework. Tudi was mentioning how this can hurt some of the businesses. And in the case of our sector, there's not a recognition of this sustainable green value, and this can hinder some of the developments and some of the investments. Now, in terms of the economics, I'm sure you'll be wondering, okay, but how much does it actually cost to capture biogenic CO2 from the biomethane? So we did a data economics exercise trying to collect CAPEX and OPEX data. Our objective was to calculate the levelized cost of capture. We took numbers directly from commercial scale projects, and this data came from project developers and operators. This is just the boundaries of the system, so you also have an idea of what I'm taking into consideration. I'm not considering the upgrading of biomethane because this is already part of the biomethane process, so the numbers I will show you will only depend on after the CO2 is separated, how much does it take to compress, pass it through a filter, the liquefaction, distillation, and your storage on tanks. Now, the results, of course, as you can imagine, are driven by multiple factors, and you have quite a wide range of cost. The first factor that we can see on the graph, it's quite logical. The higher your capture capacity is, of course, you unlock the economies of scale, and this allows cost regression. So we see with capture capacities of more than 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, the range can go between 40 euros per ton of CO2 all the way to 80. Well, if you go to smaller plants, we know that the range can expand even further. Nonetheless, we've also seen projects, and I will show it to you later on, that even if you have a smaller capacity, it is possible to capture in an economical way of having a possible business case. Other factors to consider when it comes to the CAPEX, we see that the liquefaction unit is the most cost-intensive, and for the OPEX, Of course, electricity for liquefaction will account for the highest share, even over 60% in some cases. And we also have to consider whether the CO2 capture is being done from a greenfield or a brownfield plant, meaning if from the very beginning of your design you already take into consideration that the CO2 will be captured, then the cost will be lower than if you already have a biomethane plant which did not have CO2 separation, CO2 capture. Some of the other factors that we can take into consideration is that volume aggregations, these can drive additional cost reductions. We know some projects in France or in the UK where they are taking the biogas from different plants and centralizing the upgrading and the capture of the CO2, allowing for this degression in cost.
Pablo Molina of the European Biogas Association there. What a great session that was. All three of those speakers, fantastic, weren't they?
It was fantastic. As we said a couple of times, we had what we see in the data, what we see in the confidence, what we see on the ground, and what we see from one of the arguably front and center future sourcing channels.
And we can't bring that whole event to this podcast because also on day one we had our second session around utilisation and innovation, representation from Linde, Chart Industries. Brian works on that in that panel, so that was a great one as well. Then we had day two, we were talking about infrastructure and distribution. Nippon Sanso again on that panel. But from day two, I would like to listen back to some of Stephen Harrison's keynote presentation. I don't know about you.
I'd always like to listen back to Stephen Harrison, and for anyone that's listening, you need to see him on stage and walking around the room in this instance. Very dynamic presence, yeah.
And this was an interesting topic that he covered. Again, he got into the sourcing for CO2, but particularly that low-hanging fruit for low-cost CO2 sourcing, which is becoming increasingly more important nowadays.
Yeah, and it actually ended up being a slightly contentious keynote towards the end. I don't know if we can capture any of that here, but for those of you that weren't there, yeah, Steve went into some loaded talking points around biogenic CO2, around the competition in the market and who's going to be competing for those sources essentially, and topics like CDR and certification, everything else that comes with that. And it was a very energetic Q&A session, a lot of questions coming in from the ground. Steve happily to take those and either bat them off or explain further. So yeah, that was fantastic to see.
That was great. So let's listen to just a bit of that.
I mean, I didn't expect to be coming up onto stage when I wrote my presentation in such a period of international turmoil. But what I've learned over the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years is there's no force majeure anymore. There is no force majeure. Let's stop saying it. COVID, never saw it coming. Iran, never saw it coming. Force majeure. Ukraine, never saw it coming. Force majeure. The only constant in this world right now is change. And what that means for you in terms of CO2 supply chains, value chains, is it means that the value of resilience is much, much, much higher. Think of it this way. I'm running a car plant, okay, and I've got a production line that needs 50 employees to produce all the cars I need at any one particular time. And the production manager, he comes into the CEO's office and says, "Crisis! 5 of my employees have gone away on holiday and the machines can't run and I can't produce the cars." The CEO goes, "Well, yes, but employees go on holiday. So you should plan for that and build in contingency strategies to give you the security of supply." Production manager comes back 2 weeks later to the CEO. He says, "Crisis! 4 of my employees have gone off sick with COVID. We can't run the production line anymore." The CEO goes, "Yeah, but hang on a minute. People do go off sick. It's statistically known we have 2% sickness and absence every single year, and you should man up for that." The production manager comes back 3 months later, and he says, "Oh, crisis! Some of my employees are untrained. We've just hired them, and they don't know how to run the production line, and I can't produce the cars." And the CEO says, well, yeah, sure. We always hire new employees and they always have a 2-month training program when they're not yet qualified to run the line. You should plan for that. Exactly the same for CO2 sourcing. We need to plan for these events. Not just every time they come along go, whoof, didn't see that one coming. Look, the truth is we don't know what that next one's going to be. But the other truth is there will be a next one. Don't know where, don't know why, don't know what, but it will happen. And the only thing that you can do to mitigate and reduce risk is to build resilience into your supply chains. Now, sometimes that resilience might come at a cost, but we also want to protect our profit margins and run good businesses, which means sourcing at low cost. So what I'm going to try and expose for you today is as many ways that I can think of to source CO2 at low cost and build resilience and diversity into your CO2 value chains. No CO2, no value. It's the beginning of the value chain. So why was ammonia the answer? For some people, ammonia still is the answer, but why did we go into ammonia and what has changed? Why is ammonia no longer the king of CO2 sourcing as it once was? Because CO2 capture is totally integral to ammonia production. If you look at this beautiful new facility in the United States, the big red and white tower in the middle and the big silver tower in the middle, those are basically CO2 removal equipment. So when you look at an ammonia plant, a huge amount of it is actually dedicated to removing CO2. You have to do that, otherwise you can't make ammonia. And that's why we've often gone to CO2 facilities and said, here's low-hanging fruit. They've already paid for the equipment, they've already committed the energy costs, this CO2 is very high purity, we can purify it and liquefy it and sell it to the commercial market. As we've seen in recent years, with shale gas fracking in the United States, natural gas prices coming out of the Henry Hub are very, very, very low. So cheapest natural gas in the world, okay, Russia maybe, okay, United States, Gulf Coast also. And what that means is that natural gas sources in Europe, whether it's the Dutch sources here in the North Sea, which are now largely depleted, or the Norwegian sources, are basically at a cost premium to other natural gas around the world. And what that means is that making ammonia here in Europe is too expensive. It's simply too expensive. It's cheaper to make that ammonia in the United States and bring it in on a ship. All right? So in the United Kingdom, we've seen 2 large ammonia facilities closed down, but the downstream processing on those facilities, where the ammonia is converted to nitric acid and then to ammonium nitrate, that remains. So it's not that the whole factory has closed. It's that half of the factory has closed and the ammonia is now being imported so that they can run the other half. Right? But if they're not making the ammonia, they're not emitting the CO2 and the CO2 sources have gone off stream. And those are really the big reasons that we've seen huge disruption in the UK CO2 supply chain and why the UK is now a CO2 importer. Can you believe that? With all of the industries emitting CO2 into the UK is importing commercial CO2. Can you actually believe the illogic of that?
Stephen Harrison of SBH4 there. And a couple more sessions on that final day. We got into talk on purities and standards for the new value chain. Really interesting session. And we concluded the event with a panel session looking at future sourcing pathways and pragmatism. And I think that this would make for a fantastic episode in itself of the 1895 podcast.
Yeah, arguably, what better time to discuss that with CO2 in the headlines once again, and that security of supply. I think we should bring that in the next episode, actually, Tom. But yeah, I think, across the event, you said we couldn't bring it all. We couldn't, there's just too many insights. But I think what we probably saw from that, if we were to try and distill that, is there is so much going on in the industry, and I wrote a week or so ago now in terms of this whole UK speculation of shortages, that have we learned the lessons of past shortages? I think we probably have. I think the fact that the government is talking about it and planning around it would suggest so, but we also know that the industry has learned lessons, and the industry's made great strides in the last 5 years in particular, maybe 7, to invest in and evolve the whole storage and distribution network, all of the technologies that support that, all of the ways that we're trying to extract that CO2 from these different sources and that diversification landscape. All of that was reflected across those sessions that we couldn't bring our listeners today. So yeah, it was a very positive event in that respect.
Yeah, I think so. So coming off the back of that, what are the confidence indices, or I guess the narrative of where we are right now when it comes to CO2?
Well, we've got our next poll of that kind of survey data coming up in the next couple of weeks, actually, so I'll be able to tell you more then. At the moment, it's, I think as I reflected in a previous episode, we are seeing a stability in industry sentiment, in that kind of flavour, if you like, but that doesn't mean it's improving. It's kind of stable in concern at the moment. I think, I don't have these figures to hand, unfortunately. Tom, you've put me on the spot there, but I think the kind of combined confidence in the CO2 outlook in Europe at the moment is around 25% of our survey. I think the combined concern is more like 40% or 40% plus. So at the moment, what we can say is concern is certainly outweighing confidence.
It'll be interesting to see how that develops over the coming weeks, especially when you have those final full results.
Absolutely, yeah. So Tom, I've waxed lyrical about biogas and biogenic CO2 there, this future sourcing channel that everybody seems to be so effusive about, and the strong sentiment in the room, sort of, I don't know, 70% upwards, suggesting it's the most exciting pathway for future CO2. We've got a biogas webinar coming up, haven't we?
We certainly do, depending on when you're listening or watching this, in a few days' time, or Friday the 24th of April is when we'll be going live. It will also be available on demand if you're listening to this afterwards. But yeah, we'll be looking at biogas, biogenic CO2, and what I've called an expanding industrial gas frontier. And we have a fantastic panel of speakers lined up for that. Our confirmed panel, we have David Hurren of DAH Renewable Consultancy. We have Philip Lucas of Future Biogas, who was previously on an episode of the 1895 podcast. We have representation from Arda Energy. And we also have the distributors, or not the distributors, but the
newly
producers'
confirmed,
point of view. Simon Barker from ProGas's UK. So this is a really strong panel, I think, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of that conversation with them.
Yeah, loads to get into on that, and I think, as you said, very strong panel. Good to see the different nuances of where they sit within the kind of the biogas and the CO2 sphere. I think is a great title as well, in terms of that kind of that new frontier, if you like. I can remember when we didn't even cover biogas at GasWorld, a long time ago now, but we didn't cover it, we didn't consider it an industrial gas play. Look how much has changed in that time. Look how much we now talk about the CO2 aspect. And we cover biogas in its own right as a often overlooked energy vector, actually.
And look, we've set out this agenda, this panel, this title, but it's not just our questions or our talking points that we want to hear. It's really important that our viewers get involved too, and actually get the questions answered that they want to talk about, because we have that opportunity in that live Q&A session. Yeah,
and I think I say in the closing of almost every event that we attend, that we put on, we thank the audience for shaping the event, and in many ways shaping what is to come in these conversations and business models and everything else. We get exactly that on the webinars, like you said. Sometimes that Q&A is just, we can't get through it all, can we? We don't have enough time to get through all the questions. So yeah, it's not just about us determining that, it's about the viewers and listeners.
Absolutely, so really looking forward to that webinar. So please do sign up, register, watch on demand, gasworld.tv for all of that. We'll be back next time on the podcast, and we will go back and listen to that full panel session on future sourcing and synergies, because that's a great session. We were both on stage for that one, and two fantastic speakers for that as well.
Yep, 2 female speakers as well. Shout out to the women in gases, if we can call it that. Yeah, a lot to look forward to there, I think. So looking forward to reconvening on that one.
Absolutely. And in the meantime, do please like, follow and share the 1895 podcast, and we'll be back again next time.